The night was colder than usual, the kind that froze breath mid-air and turned the world into an icy silence. Daniel Carter, a retired park ranger, sat in his modest cabin on the outskirts of Montana, nestled deep in the wilderness where the nearest neighbor was miles away. The fireplace crackled softly, its glow casting flickering shadows against the wooden walls as he sipped his coffee, enjoying the solitude he had come to love. But then a sound broke the quiet. A faint scratching at the door, barely audible over the wind. At first, Daniel dismissed it, thinking it was a branch scraping against the wood. But then came a low, desperate whimper, followed by another insistent scratch. Frowning, he set down his cup and grabbed a flashlight. He had seen stray animals wander too close to his cabin before, usually coyotes or raccoons searching for food. But as he neared the door and peered through the frosted glass window, his pulse kicked up a notch. A German shepherd stood outside, staring at him with eyes that radiated urgency. Snowflakes clung to its thick fur, its body trembling from the cold. But what caught Daniel's attention wasn't just the dog's ragged state, it was the desperation in its expression, as if it wasn't just seeking warmth, but something much more. It needed help. A desperate plea for entry. Daniel hesitated. Stray dogs weren't uncommon, but this one wasn't just passing through it, had deliberately come to his door, as though it knew where to go. Against his better judgment, he cracked the door open just a sliver. "Easy, boy," he murmured. The dog whined, stepping closer, but not barging in. It was waiting for permission. Daniel exhaled sharply. His instincts had kept him alive in the wild for decades, and they now screamed at him that this was no ordinary stray. But something in the dog's behavior, its almost human-like plea, made his chest tighten. "All right," he muttered, stepping back. "Come on in." The German shepherd darted inside instantly, shaking off the snow and immediately turning toward the door, as if waiting for something else. Daniel's brows furrowed. The dog wasn't just escaping the cold, it had come to him for a reason. And that reason was about to reveal itself. The trail through the snow. The shepherd let out a sharp bark, then ran to the door, scratching at it again. Daniel's stomach knotted. "You want me to follow you?" The dog whined, its tail flicking anxiously. Something was out there. Throwing on his coat and grabbing his rifle, Daniel stepped out into the bitter cold. The dog bolted ahead, looking back only to make sure he was following. Daniel's boots crunched against the freshly fallen snow as they ventured deeper into the woods. His breath came in sharp puffs, and the chill bit at his exposed skin. This wasn't just a stray seeking refuge, this was a rescue mission. After several minutes of trekking, Daniel spotted it. A half-buried shape in the snow. His gut twisted as he rushed forward. It was a person. A life hanging by a thread. Daniel dropped to his knees, brushing away the snow. A woman lay there, barely conscious, her lips blue from the cold. Her jacket was thin, soaked through, and her breathing was shallow. The shepherd let out another whimper and nuzzled her arm. She was alive, but just barely. "Hey," Daniel shook her lightly. "Stay with me." Her eyes fluttered open for a second, filled with fear and exhaustion. Help, her voice was barely a whisper. Daniel didn't waste a second. Lifting her carefully, he cradled her against his chest and started the trek back toward his cabin, his every step fueled by the adrenaline surging through him. The German shepherd trotted beside him, never leaving her side. A mystery unfolds. Back at the cabin, Daniel wrapped her in blankets, setting her by the fire as he brewed hot tea. Her skin was ice cold, but the color slowly returned to her face as warmth seeped in. As she stirred, Daniel finally spoke. "You're lucky your dog found me." Her lips parted, her expression clouded with confusion. "My dog?" she rasped. Daniel's hands stilled. "Yeah, the shepherd that led me to you." The woman's face paled further, her shaking fingers clutching the blanket tighter. I don't have a dog." Daniel's pulse skipped. He slowly turned to the shepherd, who now sat calmly by the door, watching them with intelligent, knowing eyes. If she wasn't the owner, then whose dog was this? And why had it led him straight to her? The unfinished story. The woman, who introduced herself as Megan Hayes, had no recollection of how she ended up lost in the snow. "I was driving," she murmured. Then I don't know. I woke up out there. Daniel frowned. No tracks led to where he had found her. It was as if she had just appeared there. The dog, meanwhile, had curled up beside her, its protective stance never wavering. Daniel studied the shepherd, a creeping realization settling over him. Had the dog been watching over her all along? Had it been waiting for someone to find her? And if so, why choose him? One thing was certain, this wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the frosted window, painting the cabin in a dim golden glow. Daniel Carter sat up on the worn-out couch, the crackling fireplace keeping the room warm. His eyes darted to the German shepherd, who was now curled up in the corner, its ears twitching at the distant howling wind. It had been a long night. The shepherd had led Daniel through the bitter cold, straight to a half-frozen woman buried in the snow. The mystery deepened when she had murmured through chattering teeth, "I don't have a dog." And yet, the shepherd remained guarding her, watching Daniel. An unspoken bond. Daniel stretched his stiff limbs and stood, feeling the weight of the previous night's events pressing on his chest. He moved toward the woman, Megan Hayes, who lay wrapped in layers of blankets near the fire. Her breathing was slow but steady, the warmth having brought some color back to her face. The shepherd lifted its head as Daniel approached, its amber eyes sharp with quiet intelligence. "You don't belong to her," Daniel murmured, crouching down to scratch behind the dog's ears. "So who do you belong to?" The dog didn't react, just stared at him with a knowing expression, almost as if it were waiting. Then, Megan stirred. Her eyelashes fluttered before her eyes finally opened. She blinked, confused, before focusing on Daniel. A moment passed before her gaze shifted toward the dog, her face tightening with unease. "That dog," she whispered, her voice hoarse. Daniel frowned. "You sure you don't recognize him?" "He led me straight to you." Megan swallowed hard, her pale fingers tightening around the blanket. "No, but I think I've seen it before. Right before I blacked out. A faint memory." Daniel settled on the chair next to her. "Can you remember what happened?" Megan exhaled shakily, her gaze distant. "I was driving down the back road near the old logging trail. It was late, and the snow was falling fast. I saw headlights in my rearview mirror too close, almost pushing me. I tried to speed up, but the road was slick, and I lost control. My car went off the road, and after that, it's all a blur." Daniel's jaw tightened. "You think someone was following you?" Megan nodded, eyes shadowed with fear. "I don't think it was an accident that I ended up out there." Silence stretched between them. The shepherd stood suddenly, its ears perked, nose twitching toward the door. A low growl rumbled in its chest. "A visitor in the snow." Daniel stiffened. Living in isolation for so many years, he had developed a sense for when something was off. And right now, the hairs on the back of his neck were standing up. He grabbed his rifle from the wall and moved to the window, peering through the frost-covered glass. Footsteps. Someone had been out there recently just beyond the tree line where the fresh snow had been disturbed. His pulse quickened. "Stay here," he murmured to Megan, then turned to the dog. "Come on, boy." The shepherd didn't hesitate. It moved with him, its stance cautious yet controlled. Daniel stepped outside into the bitter cold, his breath forming clouds in the air. His boots crunched against the snow as he followed the tracks leading away from the cabin. The shepherd stayed close, its nose to the ground, tail stiff with tension. The tracks led toward the edge of the trees, where they abruptly disappeared. No footprints leading in another direction. It was as if whoever had been there had simply vanished. A chill that had nothing to do with the cold ran down Daniel's spine. Then, a sound. A sharp, distant creak, like the weight of something shifting in the forest. Daniel gripped his rifle tighter. "Who's out there?" He called into the trees. Silence. The shepherd let out a low, warning bark. Daniel's gut told him one thing: they weren't alone. A truth buried in snow. He scanned the tree line again, but the snowfall was too heavy now, blurring everything in white. Whoever had been watching was gone or waiting. He exhaled sharply and turned back toward the cabin. The shepherd trotted beside him, casting one last glance over its shoulder before following. Inside, Megan sat up, her face drawn. Someone's out there, aren't they? Daniel nodded, setting his rifle aside. Yeah, and they weren't just passing through. Megan shivered, hugging the blanket closer around her. I don't know who they are, but I think I was supposed to die out there, Daniel. The weight of her words settled like a stone in his chest. The shepherd sat at the door, ears alert, watching, waiting. Daniel ran a hand through his graying hair, his mind racing. He didn't know how deep this went. But one thing was clear, this wasn't over. And the German shepherd knew it too. Daniel Carter was no stranger to the wilderness, but nothing could have prepared him for the events of the past 2 days. The German shepherd, the one who had appeared at his doorstep as if guided by fate, had already led him to one mystery: the near-frozen woman in the snow, Megan Hayes. Now, as the dawn light crept over the snow-covered land, another mystery was unfolding. The dog's low growl rumbled through the warm air of the cabin, a stark contrast to the peaceful crackling of the fire. Daniel, still half asleep in his chair, felt a chill run down his spine. The shepherd was staring at the door, hackles raised, its posture tense. Something or someone was outside. A shadow in the snow. Daniel instinctively reached for his rifle, but he hesitated. If it was an animal, the shepherd wouldn't be acting this way. This growl was different. It was a warning. Moving cautiously, he peered through the frost-covered window. His breath hitched. Just beyond the tree line, a dark figure moved between the branches. Not an animal. A man. Daniel's heart pounded. Whoever it was had been watching them. The dog let out a sharper bark, shifting toward the door. Megan stirred from her spot on the couch, her eyes groggy. What's going on? Daniel didn't answer right away. Instead, he slowly cracked the door open, just enough to let the cold air rush in. Hello, he called, his voice firm but cautious. Silence. The figure vanished behind a tree, blending into the morning's dim light. Daniel's grip on the door tightened. If you need help, say something. Nothing. He stepped outside, the shepherd following closely. Fresh footprints led around the cabin, overlapping with the ones Daniel himself had made earlier when he'd gathered wood. The realization sent a chill down his spine. Whoever this was, they had been here before. A chilling discovery. Daniel's instincts screamed at him to return inside, but his feet carried him forward, following the tracks around the side of the cabin. Then he saw it. Near the woodpile, something was half buried in the snow. A bundle of some kind. A bag? The shepherd sniffed at it, then let out a sharp bark. Daniel reached down, brushing the snow aside, then froze. It wasn't a bag. It was a coat, and inside a wallet. His fingers trembled as he flipped it open. The ID card inside was worn but still readable. James Foster. Daniel's breath caught. Megan. She had followed him outside, her blanket still wrapped around her shoulders. When she saw what he was holding, her face paled. That's my father's name. The truth they didn't want found. Daniel's pulse pounded. Megan's father? That couldn't be a coincidence. He scanned the area, his breath fogging in the freezing air. Your father, when was the last time you saw him? Megan swallowed hard. When I was 8 years old. Her voice was barely above a whisper. He disappeared. Daniel's grip on the wallet tightened. The German shepherd whined, pacing anxiously beside them, as if urging them to look deeper. Daniel reached into the coat's inner pocket and pulled out a folded, yellowed piece of paper. His hands shook as he opened it. There were 2 words scrawled across it in faded ink. They found me. The cold air suddenly felt suffocating. Megan gasped. Oh my God! The men in the trees. A snap of a branch made them both whirl around. A second figure now stood at the edge of the woods. Watching. Waiting. Daniel instinctively pushed Megan behind him, rifle raised. The shepherd barked, snarling now, its stance one of pure protection. Then, just as quickly as the figure had appeared, it disappeared. Daniel didn't lower his weapon. His gut told him this wasn't over. They know, Megan whispered, her eyes wide with fear. They know we found this. Daniel exhaled, forcing himself to think. Whoever had buried this coat, Whoever had been lurking around his cabin wasn't expecting them to find it. But the shepherd had known. The dog had led them here on purpose. Running out of time, Daniel didn't waste another second. "We need to leave. Now." Megan nodded, her fear turning to resolve. "But where do we go?" Daniel's mind worked fast. If someone was watching them, waiting for them to make a move, they needed to act first. The dog let out another low growl, glancing toward the car as if answering for them. Daniel took a deep breath. "We go somewhere they won't expect." But first, he turned, hurrying inside. He grabbed the rifle, a few supplies, and the coat. Because whatever this was, whatever James Foster had discovered before he vanished, it wasn't buried deep enough. And someone wanted it to stay that way. As Daniel and Megan climbed into the truck, the shepherd jumped into the back seat, its sharp eyes locked on the dark tree line. They weren't alone out here. And if they didn't move fast, they might never get another chance. Daniel Carter had never considered himself much of a rescuer, but fate had other plans. First, the German shepherd had appeared at his doorstep, desperate and relentless. Then came Megan Hayes, half frozen in the snow, her past tangled with the mystery of her missing father. And now, a stranger stood before him, a woman with piercing eyes and an urgent presence, demanding to know about the dog that had started it all. A stranger in the snow. The cold wind whipped through the trees, making the stranger's parka billow as she took a cautious step forward. "Are they inside?" she repeated, her breath curling in the frigid air. Daniel instinctively tensed, stepping between her and the cabin. "Who's asking?" She exhaled sharply. "I've been tracking that German shepherd for days. He belongs to someone, maybe me, maybe someone else. I need to see him." The words hit Daniel like a hammer. Tracking him? The shepherd had led him to Megan's unconscious body in the snow. It had acted with clear purpose, intelligence more than any stray should. And now, someone was looking for him? His fingers itched toward his rifle, but he kept his expression neutral. "Why not knock on my door instead of sneaking around?" The woman hesitated, glancing toward the dim glow of the cabin window. "Because I needed to be sure." Daniel studied her carefully. Her stance was firm, but there was no malice in her face, only urgency. "Come inside," he finally said, but cautiously. "Move slow. I don't want him thinking you're a threat." Inside the cabin, a reunion or a warning? The warmth of the cabin wrapped around them as Daniel shut the door behind her. The shepherd, resting by the fire, lifted his head instantly, ears pricking forward. The moment the woman's gaze landed on the dog, something in her expression shifted. Relief, recognition, and something else, sorrow. She crouched carefully, keeping her hands open and low. "Hey there, buddy," she murmured, her voice dropping into something softer, familiar. "It's okay. I'm a friend." The shepherd stared, unmoving. His eyes locked onto hers, his body poised not in fear but in deep, unshakable focus. Daniel watched, heart hammering. This wasn't just a search. This was personal. "You know him," Daniel said, his voice quiet but firm. The woman swallowed. "Yes, I do." "A dog with a mission." She reached out, and the shepherd finally moved, stepping toward her cautiously. His nose brushed her fingers. Then came a small whimper, not of fear, but of recognition. Daniel let out a slow breath. Megan, still wrapped in a blanket on the couch, sat up. "Who is he?" she asked. The woman hesitated. Then she looked up at Daniel. "I think you already know," she said carefully. "This dog didn't just wander here. He was looking for you." Daniel's mind reeled. "What are you saying?" She ran a hand through her hair. "I work with Canine Rescue and Rehabilitation. This shepherd belonged to someone before, but he wasn't just a pet. He was trained for search and rescue. But here's the thing, he was reported missing 6 months ago." Megan sat up straighter, her eyes wide. Daniel frowned. "And you think he came here on purpose?" The woman nodded. "German shepherds don't just disappear. If he traveled this far, he was searching for something." She hesitated. "Or someone." Daniel's pulse quickened. He looked at the dog, who was watching them both carefully. What had led this dog to his door? And who had he been looking for? The truth hidden in the snow. The woman Kara stood up and crossed the room. Listen, I've been tracking this shepherd for weeks, but I didn't expect him to end up here in the middle of nowhere. That's not a coincidence. She turned toward Megan. You were the first person he led Daniel to, weren't you? Megan's breath caught. Yes. Kara's lips pressed together. Then I need to ask you, who else would he be looking for? Silence filled the room. And then Megan inhaled sharply, her face paling. My father. Daniel felt the air shift. Megan had been found in the snow, half frozen, half conscious, the same night Daniel had taken in the dog. The shepherd had been frantic, desperate to lead Daniel somewhere. But what if Megan wasn't the only one he was trying to save? What if someone was still out there? A dangerous decision. Daniel clenched his jaw. Then we go back. We follow where he was leading me before I found Megan. Megan looked hesitant, fear flickering in her eyes. If we go out there and we're right, she swallowed, we might find something we don't want to find. Daniel nodded. Or we find him in time. Kara glanced at the shepherd, then back at them. I'll go with you. Megan hesitated, but finally, she nodded. Daniel grabbed his coat, heart pounding as he opened the door. The cold night greeted them once more, the wind whispering against the trees. The shepherd stood at the threshold, looking out into the dark, waiting. Then, as if understanding their decision, he stepped forward into the snow, leading them into the unknown. As the first light of dawn filtered through the frost-covered windows, Daniel Carter felt the weight of the past few days settle heavily on his shoulders. The German shepherd, who had arrived at his doorstep, half-starved and desperate, was no longer just a stray dog seeking warmth. He was the missing piece in a story far bigger than Daniel had ever imagined. The final plan. Kara, the field researcher who had spent months tracking the shepherd and his lost companion, stretched stiffly from where she had dozed off near the fireplace. She glanced at Daniel, then at the shepherd, who lay curled up next to the couch, eyes barely open but still alert. He's strong, she murmured, but he won't make it out here on his own for much longer. If we can get him to our center today, he has a real chance at recovery. Daniel nodded, though a tightness gripped his chest. He had never been one for emotional attachments, but something about this dog, the way he had arrived, the way he had led Daniel to Megan in the snow, the way he seemed to know things before anyone else did, had made it nearly impossible to think of letting him go. But he knew what had to be done. Kara moved toward the shepherd, kneeling beside him with careful movements. We need to get him accustomed to the carrier, she said, gesturing to the portable kennel she had set up near the door. If he resists, we could stress him too much before transport. Daniel watched as she extended her hand, murmuring softly. The shepherd's ears twitched, but he didn't pull away. You know me, don't you? She whispered. You remember? The dog's head tilted slightly, his brown eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made Daniel's breath catch. It was almost as if the shepherd did remember her. A memory resurfaces. Megan stirred from the couch, rubbing sleep from her eyes. He's been leading us somewhere, she murmured. He saved my life. What if... She hesitated, biting her lip. What if he's still looking for something? Daniel frowned. What do you mean? Megan looked at the shepherd. When I collapsed in the snow, he didn't stop searching. You said he kept tugging your sleeve, trying to get you to follow. But follow where? A strange silence filled the cabin. Daniel felt his pulse quicken. The dog had never stopped moving, never stopped searching. If he was tracking something or someone, what if they weren't done yet? The final search. The three of them bundled up quickly. The shepherd, as if sensing the urgency, stood and trotted toward the door before they even opened it. Daniel grabbed his coat, slipping his rifle over his shoulder, just in case. The sun had barely risen, casting an eerie glow over the vast, snow-covered forest. The shepherd sniffed the air, then began to move. We follow him, Daniel muttered. Megan fell in step beside him, her face pale but determined. Kara followed, keeping close but quiet, letting the dog do his work. The shepherd's paws pressed into the deep snow, his movements sure and swift despite the cold. His tail was low, his nose to the ground, his entire body alert. This wasn't just a casual walk. This was a mission. They trekked for nearly an hour, the only sound the crunching of snow beneath their boots. Then, suddenly, the shepherd stopped. He let out a sharp bark. Daniel's stomach twisted. Ahead, something dark lay partially buried in the snow. Megan let out a choked gasp. Daniel ran forward. The truth in the snow. It was a man, or, at least, what remained of him. Frozen beneath a thin layer of ice, his features were barely recognizable, but his coat, partially unzipped, revealed something Daniel immediately recognized. A badge. Megan fell to her knees, trembling. Kara covered her mouth in shock. The shepherd stood beside the body, letting out a long, low whimper. Daniel swallowed hard. Megan's voice was barely a whisper. "It's him, my father." A hero's final act. The pieces fell into place all at once. Megan's father, a retired officer, had gone missing months ago during a snowstorm. The German shepherd had been his K9 partner, loyal until the end. When the storm hit, they must have been separated, the dog surviving while his handler did not. But the dog never stopped searching. And in his desperate attempt to find the man he had lost, he had found Daniel instead. The goodbye that wasn't goodbye. They called the authorities. It took hours for the team to arrive, and when they did, Megan could barely speak. The shepherd never left her side. As the officers worked, Kara turned to Daniel. "He led you here for a reason." Daniel nodded, feeling a lump in his throat. He never gave up on him. Kara smiled softly. German shepherds never do. The shepherd looked up at Daniel then, his eyes full of something unspoken. A deep understanding. A thank you. Maybe even a goodbye. A new beginning. In the days that followed, Megan made arrangements for her father's funeral. The shepherd, now officially identified as Axel, was taken to the rehabilitation center to recover. But Daniel knew. Axel wasn't meant to stay there. 1 week later, as Daniel sat by his fireplace, he heard a familiar scratching at his door. When he opened it, Axel stood there, tail wagging, as if he had always belonged. Daniel let out a deep breath and smiled. "Well, buddy," he said, stepping aside. "What are you waiting for? Get in here." And just like that, Axel was home. A German shepherd's plea, a journey through the frozen wilderness. The wind howled as Daniel Carter navigated the snowmobile through the thickening forest, his breath visible in the icy air. The German shepherds, one injured, the other fiercely protective, lay curled in the makeshift sled behind them, their golden eyes peering cautiously at the unfamiliar terrain. Kara, the wildlife researcher who had spent months tracking the dogs, adjusted the radio strapped to her belt, listening for updates from her colleagues. "They're still on their way," she called over the roaring engine. "But the storm's moving in faster than expected. We need to hurry." Daniel clenched his jaw. He had seen what winter storms could do out here. The landscape could turn into a whiteout within minutes, making even a simple journey life-threatening. "Hold on," he muttered, tightening his grip on the handlebars as he picked up speed. A storm closing in. The sled bumped and jostled over the uneven terrain, but the larger German shepherd remained steady, curling its body around its injured companion, shielding it from the worst of the cold. Daniel couldn't help but admire the loyalty between them. Even in the face of pain, the injured dog didn't whimper, it simply pressed closer to its protector. He'd never seen anything like it. A sharp gust of wind sent a fresh spray of snow across his visor, momentarily blinding him. He cursed under his breath, slowing just enough to regain control. Then, through the blur of white, he spotted something ahead. Tracks. Not just their own. Daniel's pulse quickened. "We're not alone out here," he said over his shoulder. Kara twisted around, following his gaze. The tracks, half buried in the fresh snowfall, were unmistakable. More wolves. The pack is watching. Daniel eased off the throttle. The last thing they needed was an ambush. He knew wolves weren't mindless attackers, but they were territorial, and if these two dogs had been separated from a larger pack, there was no telling how they would react. "Stay alert," Kara whispered, her hand hovering near the tranquilizer dart she carried for emergencies. The trees around them seemed to shift with unseen movement, and then just beyond the ridge a set of glowing eyes appeared. Then another. And another. Daniel exhaled slowly, his heart pounding. A pack of at least 5 wolves stood at the crest of the ridge, their dark silhouettes stark against the snow. They didn't move. They simply watched. The injured shepherd let out a soft whimper, its ears flattening. The larger dog, sensing its distress, lifted its head and let out a low, rumbling growl of warning. The wolves remained still. "They're assessing us," Kara murmured. "They don't know whether we're a threat or if these two belong to them." Daniel's stomach twisted. If these wolves recognized the German shepherds as part of their own, if they had been separated in that blizzard, would they try to take them back? Would they attack to do it? A tense standoff. For what felt like an eternity, the two groups remained locked in silent observation. The wind howled around them, and Daniel could barely feel his fingers through his gloves. Then, without warning, one of the wolves let out a single, mournful howl. The larger shepherd's ears twitched. It lifted its head slightly, almost as if responding. Kara's breath hitched. "They know them," she whispered. Daniel frowned, watching the German shepherd closely. The bigger dog's body was tense, caught between instinct and survival. Then, ever so slowly, it began to shift in the sled, like it wanted to stand. A reunion? Or a final goodbye? The injured shepherd, weak but aware, nudged closer to its companion. But as the wind picked up again, it let out a soft whine, one that the wolves on the ridge heard clearly. And just like that, the pack began to move. One by one, they turned and disappeared into the trees, their dark forms blending into the shadows. The larger shepherd watched them go, ears flicking, tail twitching, but it didn't move. It made a choice. It was staying. Daniel released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Looks like they're not coming for them after all." Kara nodded slowly. "No, they understand now. The pack had left them behind once. They wouldn't do it again." The journey continues. The moment passed, and Daniel didn't waste time restarting the engine. They weren't out of the storm yet, and he had no intention of testing fate any further. As the snowmobile surged forward, carving a path through the drifts, the shepherds remained where they were, one resting, the other watching. Kara adjusted her radio again, finally catching a clear signal. "We're almost there," she confirmed. "The team is set up by the creek. Just another mile to go." Daniel gave a sharp nod and pushed forward. The wind fought them, the cold gnawed at his face, but he didn't slow down. His shepherds now needed to make it, and he'd make sure they did. A final decision. By the time they reached the frozen creek, 2 figures were waiting for them, Kara's colleagues, bundled up against the cold, their truck idling nearby with the back open and ready. Daniel pulled the snowmobile to a stop. Kara slid off first, approaching her team. "They made it," she called, relief evident in her voice. The larger shepherd stood as soon as the vehicle stopped, ears alert, body tense. It knew. It was time to go. Kara's team moved quickly but carefully, lifting the injured shepherd from the sled and transferring it to the truck's heated interior. The larger shepherd jumped in on its own, never taking its eyes off its sibling. Daniel felt a pang of something he couldn't quite name. He had saved them, cared for them, and now they were leaving. Kara turned to him, hesitating. "You could come," she offered. "See them through their recovery." Daniel hesitated. The cabin, his solitude, it had always been enough. But now, he looked at the shepherd, the one that had protected its sibling through the worst of the storm, the one that had chosen to stay with him instead of following the pack. Maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end. Maybe it was just the beginning. Daniel let out a slow breath and gave a small nod. "All right," he said. "Let's go." A shepherd's plea, the final test. The wind roared through the trees, shaking the makeshift shelter as Daniel Carter stood at the edge of the temporary camp, his breath fogging in the icy air. He watched as the rescue team worked swiftly, securing the shelter against the approaching blizzard. The 2 German shepherds, one still injured, the other standing guard, were huddled together on the thick blankets near the fire. Daniel had spent days caring for them, guiding them through the harshest part of the winter, and now, as they were finally in expert hands, A strange sense of loss crept into his chest. Kara stepped beside him, brushing the snow from her sleeves. "They trust you," she said, nodding toward the dogs. "That's rare, even for a rescue." Daniel exhaled, shifting his gaze to the larger shepherd, who had barely taken its eyes off him since they arrived. "They didn't have a choice," he admitted. "They were out of options." Kara gave him a knowing look. "Maybe. But animals know things we don't. They sense things in people, things that go beyond survival." Daniel didn't reply. He just watched as Nina, the field medic, carefully examined the injured dog's leg. The smaller shepherd winced but didn't snap. The fire crackled, but the warmth did little against the creeping cold. The storm breaks. A sudden gust of wind slammed into the shelter, sending a flurry of snow and ice into the air. Dan, the lead rescuer, cursed under his breath. "Storm's here," he called. "We need to brace down now." The team worked quickly, securing the last of the tarps, weighing them down with heavy packs and logs to prevent them from being torn away. "Everyone inside!" Kara yelled over the howling wind. Daniel moved toward the fire, kneeling beside the shepherds. He ran a hand over the larger one's thick coat. "Come on, boy. We have to move." The German shepherd hesitated. Its golden eyes locked onto Daniel's, searching, questioning. Then, without warning, it leaned against him, pressing its weight into his side. A silent acknowledgement. Daniel's throat tightened. "It's okay," he murmured, scratching behind its ears. "We'll get through this." The shepherd gave a soft huff before finally stepping toward the shelter. Just as the last of them ducked inside. Trapped in the whiteout. Snow pounded the tarps, the wind rattling the structure like a beast trying to claw its way inside. Visibility dropped to nothing beyond the fire's glow, and even that flickered under the storm's wrath. Inside, everyone huddled close, wrapped in thick blankets. The injured shepherd lay curled at Daniel's feet, its breathing steady, while the larger one positioned itself between him and the entrance, ever watchful. The team kept the radio close, listening for updates. The storm was worse than expected. Rescue vehicles wouldn't be able to reach them until morning. "Guess we're stuck here for the night," Nina muttered. No one argued. For hours, the storm raged. The shelter shook, the fire dimmed, but inside, the bond between man and beast held strong. Daniel barely slept. Every time the wind shrieked, the shepherd stirred. He reached out absently, running his fingers through their fur, grounding himself in their presence. They weren't just animals. They were family. The morning light. At some point, the storm passed. The first signs were subtle. The wind calmed. The flickering fire steadied. The air no longer carried the brutal bite of an incoming gust. By dawn, the world outside had transformed into a pristine white expanse. The sun, weak but present, cast long golden streaks over the snowdrifts. The team emerged slowly, stretching stiff limbs, taking in the aftermath. Dan checked the radio. "Good news," he called. "Our transport's an hour out. They'll take the shepherds to the rehab center, get them fully checked out before planning a release." Daniel exhaled, nodding. It was what needed to happen. But when he turned, he found the larger shepherd staring at him. Still watching. Still waiting. Daniel swallowed. "What?" he murmured. The dog's ears flicked forward. It knew. This wasn't just the end of a journey. It was a choice. Kara stepped beside him, arms crossed. "You know," she said, "they don't have to go back to the wild." Daniel hesitated. "They're not pets." "No," she agreed. "But not every animal belongs where they were born. Some find new places. New people." She smiled. "New homes." He looked down at the shepherds. The smaller one needed more healing, more care, but it would likely return to the pack. The larger one, though, it had made its choice. And maybe, just maybe, so had Daniel. He knelt, running a hand over the dog's back. "You want to stay, boy?" The shepherd lifted its head, pressing its forehead against his. A final answer. Daniel chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Well, guess I'm not living alone anymore." Kara grinned. "Didn't think you were meant to." As the rescue truck arrived, loading up the injured shepherd for treatment, Daniel stayed behind with his new companion at his side. He'd opened his door to a desperate plea in the middle of a storm. And now, he wasn't just saving a life. He was gaining one. A shepherd's plea, the storm's final test. The wind roared against the shelter, a relentless force testing their fragile refuge. Snow slammed into the tarps, rattling the structure as though some unseen beast was trying to claw its way inside. Daniel Carter tightened his grip on the ropes, securing the flapping fabric, his breath coming in white puffs against the freezing air. They had prepared as best they could, but nature was always unpredictable, and this storm was pushing them to their limits. Inside the shelter, the two German shepherds lay curled together on a bed of blankets, their bodies pressed close for warmth. The injured one had stopped shivering, thanks to the sedative and the fire's modest heat, but the larger dog remained vigilant. Its sharp eyes darted between the humans, still protective despite its exhaustion. Kara crouched beside them, checking the bandages on the smaller dog's leg. "She's holding steady," she murmured, her voice barely audible over the wind. "But we need to get her to the center soon. Infection is still a real danger." Daniel nodded but cast a wary glance outside. "Not in this storm." Dan, the lead rescuer, wiped snow from his face. "We wait. No other choice." Waiting meant enduring. The fire crackled weakly, fighting against the cold that seeped through every gap in the shelter. Daniel looked at the larger shepherd, who hadn't taken its eyes off him. There was a silent conversation happening between them, one that neither could fully explain. "You're still worried, huh?" Daniel muttered, running a gloved hand over the dog's thick fur. The shepherd exhaled through its nose, as if acknowledging his words. The longest night. Hours crawled by. No one slept, not fully. They took turns tending to the fire, reinforcing the tarps, and checking on the shepherds. The storm showed no signs of easing, and the howling wind made conversation near impossible. At some point, Kara nudged Daniel's shoulder. "Look at them," she whispered. Daniel turned. The larger shepherd had stretched out alongside its injured companion, pressing its body tightly against her side. But it wasn't just offering warmth, it was shaking. Daniel frowned. "What's wrong?" Kara's expression tightened. It's stressed, overwhelmed. The realization hit Daniel hard. The bigger shepherd had been holding everything together, keeping its siblings safe through the worst of the cold, starvation, and fear. But now, with humans taking over, it didn't know what to do. It wasn't in control anymore. Without thinking, Daniel reached out, resting a firm hand on the shepherd's side. The dog flinched at first, then slowly relaxed under his touch. "It's okay," he murmured. "You're not alone anymore." The shepherd let out a soft whimper and, for the first time since their journey began, rested its head on Daniel's knee. The storm breaks. The first sign of dawn came as a dull glow behind thick clouds. The storm had weakened, the wind no longer screaming but sighing against the trees. Snow had piled high around the shelter, nearly burying the entrance, but the worst had passed. Dan checked the radio, pressing the speaker against his ear to hear past the static. "They're on their way," he announced. "A.T. 30 minutes. Relief flooded the group. Daniel turned to the shepherds. The injured one stirred, lifting her head groggily. The bandages held, but she was still weak. The larger dog nudged her gently, encouragement in the form of a quiet whine. Kara smiled. They made it. Daniel exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the past few days settle in his chest. They weren't out of the woods yet, but the worst was behind them. A choice to be made. By the time the rescue team arrived, the snow had stopped falling, leaving the world blanketed in untouched white. The transport vehicle, a reinforced truck with heated compartments, pulled up near the tree line, the sound of its engine cutting through the morning silence. Kara and Nina moved quickly, preparing the shepherds for transport. The injured one was carefully lifted onto a padded stretcher, her body limp but stable. The larger shepherd, however, resisted. It paced anxiously, ears flat, eyes darting between the humans and the truck. It didn't want to leave. Daniel swallowed. He knelt, meeting the dog's gaze. "You need to go with her," he said softly. "She needs you." The shepherd whined, hesitating. Kara approached cautiously. "Daniel, she began, then hesitated. There's another option. He looked at her. This one, she gestured to the larger shepherd, it's bonded to you. More than to us. Some rescues, they choose where they belong. Daniel's heart pounded. You're saying I should keep him? Kara smiled. I'm saying he already made that decision. Daniel looked back at the shepherd. The dog had stopped pacing. It was waiting for his answer. For a long moment, he was silent. He had never planned for this. Never imagined his quiet life would be upended by a desperate animal on his doorstep, let alone two. But now, with the snow settling and the storm behind them, he couldn't picture his life going back to the way it was before. Finally, he let out a breath and scratched behind the dog's ear. Guess you're staying, buddy. The shepherd's tail gave the faintest wag. Kara grinned. Didn't think you were meant to be alone anyway. As the rescue team prepared to leave, Daniel stood with his new companion by his side, watching the truck disappear down the snow-packed road. He had saved a life that night, and in doing so, he had changed his own. A shepherd's plea, the journey home. The world outside the shelter was breathtaking, covered in a fresh blanket of snow that sparkled under the soft morning light. It was hard to believe that, just hours ago, they had fought through one of the worst storms in recent memory. Daniel Carter took a deep breath, the cold air biting at his lungs as he surveyed the surroundings. The storm had passed, but now a new challenge lay ahead: how to get the injured German shepherd and its loyal sibling to safety. Inside the makeshift shelter, the two shepherds lay nestled together. The smaller one was still groggy from the sedative, its injured leg carefully wrapped in fresh bandages. The larger dog, ever watchful, kept its eyes on Daniel as he crouched near the entrance, preparing for the next steps. He had earned its trust, but the shepherd still wasn't ready to let its guard down completely. Kara adjusted the radio strap across her shoulder. Dan and Nina are still working on clearing the road, she reported. Best estimate another few hours before we can move. Daniel exhaled, rubbing his gloved hands together. Then we wait. But the larger shepherd was restless. It paced near the entrance, occasionally sniffing at the frigid air, ears pricked as though listening for something unseen. They're sensing something, Daniel muttered. Kara glanced over. Could be their pack. Or just nerves. They've been through a lot. Daniel wasn't so sure. Something in the shepherd's body language told him this wasn't just anxiety, it was anticipation. A sign in the snow. As the hours crawled by, Daniel volunteered to step outside and scout for more firewood. The fresh snowfall had buried much of their surroundings, making it difficult to gather enough kindling. Kara agreed but warned him not to go far. The snow's deep, and the cold can turn deadly fast. Arming himself with a shovel and a small hatchet, Daniel set off, sticking close to the tree line. The world was eerily silent, save for the occasional distant crack of ice shifting in the wind. He filled his arms with fallen branches and was about to turn back when he spotted something unusual near the far end of the clearing. Tracks. His breath caught. They weren't human. And they weren't from small forest creatures either. These were deep, deliberate paw prints, several of them, leading toward the shelter. His heart pounded. More dogs? Wolves? The pack? Instinct told him to follow. He carefully stepped through the knee-deep snow, tracing the prints. They led toward a cluster of trees, then vanished near the edge of a rocky ridge. The area was eerily still. If another animal had been nearby, it was either watching him or had moved on. A low whine from behind made him turn. The larger shepherd had followed him. It stood at the edge of the clearing, its golden-brown coat dusted with snow, eyes locked on the ridge ahead. It let out another soft whimper, then turned its head back toward the shelter as if urging Daniel to follow. Something inside him stirred. The dog wasn't just restless. It was searching for something. A long-awaited reunion. Daniel hesitated only a moment before stepping forward, following the shepherd's lead. As they moved carefully across the snowy terrain, the dog's body language shifted, ears alert, tail low but wagging slightly. It was tracking something familiar. And then, just beyond the ridge, movement. A blur of fur and cautious eyes peeked through the trees. Another shepherd. No, two, maybe more. Daniel's breath hitched. The pack. The larger shepherd let out a sharp, excited bark. A responding call echoed from the trees, tentative at first, then stronger. The pack emerged, hesitant but curious, their bodies tense with recognition and uncertainty. Daniel stepped back, watching in awe. He didn't need to understand their language to know what was happening. They had found each other. The larger shepherd bounded forward, tail wagging in large, sweeping arcs. The other dogs sniffed and circled, cautiously welcoming their lost member back into the fold. But then, something remarkable happened. The injured shepherd, the one still in the shelter, let out a weak whimper. The pack froze. Then, as if understanding what was at stake, two of the dogs broke away from the group and trotted toward the shelter, noses high, ears forward. They hadn't just come for the larger dog, they had come for both. The hardest decision. Daniel jogged back to the shelter, the pack following closely. Kara and Nina looked up in surprise as the group of German shepherds appeared, their eyes wide with recognition. "They found them," Daniel said breathlessly. The pack came back for them. Kara's face softened with realization. Then we may have another option. They had planned to take the injured dog to the wildlife center for treatment. But now, with the pack here, another choice presented itself. Would the shepherds recover better in captivity, or would they be stronger with their own kind? Daniel crouched next to the injured dog, scratching gently behind its ears. "You fought so hard to get here," he murmured. "I won't make this choice for you." He unfastened the blankets, giving the dog space. The pack watched, waiting. Then slowly, painfully, the injured shepherd lifted its head. It whimpered, then let out a soft, breathy bark. The response was instant. The pack stepped forward, surrounding their lost members with warmth and reassurance. Kara wiped a tear from her cheek. "We've done what we could." Daniel swallowed hard. "They'll be okay." The injured dog, now standing with the support of its siblings, turned and gave Daniel a long, searching look. Then, as the pack shifted around them, they disappeared into the trees. Daniel stood in the snow long after they were gone. A farewell and a beginning. The group packed up their gear, the silence between them heavy but not sad. Kara clapped Daniel on the shoulder. "You saved them, you know?" Daniel let out a breath. No, they saved each other. As they climbed onto the snowmobile and started their return journey, Daniel glanced back one last time toward the trees where the shepherds had vanished. He had taken them in, given them warmth and safety. But in the end, they had chosen their own path. And somehow, knowing they were free, that they had made it home, was all the closure he needed. A shepherd's plea, a struggle against the wild. The hours passed in uneasy silence, broken only by the occasional crackling of the fire and the whistling wind outside the makeshift shelter. Daniel Carter sat near the warmth, his thoughts trapped between the wolves he had already helped and the one still out there, wandering alone in the frozen wilderness. He had seen desperation before, whether in people or animals, but something about that lone wolf had unsettled him in a way he couldn't shake. Kara, sensing his restlessness, finally spoke. "You're still thinking about it, aren't you?" She was kneeling beside the smaller German shepherd, checking its bandaged leg, ensuring the swelling hadn't worsened. Daniel sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. Yeah, something wasn't right. It was injured, starving, but more than that, it was afraid. And not of me. Kara nodded, thoughtful. "You think it was running from something else?" Daniel exhaled, staring into the fire. "I don't know. But my gut tells me it needs help." Nina, who had been listening from the other side of the shelter, leaned in. "If it's part of the same pack, maybe it's been searching for these two." She motioned toward the sleeping shepherds. "That kind of bond, if it's strong enough, it might be leading it back here." Dan, who had just returned from another failed attempt at clearing the road, shook his head. "Or it could be a lone rogue, dangerous and unpredictable. It's not our job to track it down, Daniel. You've already done more than enough." But Daniel wasn't convinced. Every instinct told him that Wolf was more than just a passing shadow in the trees. It had been near their camp for a reason. It had come looking for something. Or someone. And it was still out there. Into the white abyss. The wind had died down by the time Daniel made his decision. He couldn't ignore the pull in his chest. He had to go back. "I need to check," he announced, grabbing his coat and slipping his rifle over his shoulder, not to harm, but to protect himself if necessary. "I won't go far, just back to where I saw it." Kara stood up, frowning. "Daniel, if you go out there alone and something happens, we won't find you in this snow." "I'll leave markers," he reassured her, "and I'll be back before sunset." Dan groaned, rubbing his temples. "Stubborn old fool," he muttered, but there was a hint of respect in his voice. Kara hesitated before finally nodding. "Be careful. If it gets too risky, come back. No wolf is worth your life." Daniel gave her a tight smile before stepping out into the cold. The landscape was eerily quiet. The snow stretched endlessly in every direction, broken only by the faint traces of tracks, the ones he had seen earlier. He followed them cautiously, his breath forming small clouds in the frozen air. He didn't have to go far. Within minutes, he spotted movement near the tree line. The wolf. It was crouched low, partially hidden behind a fallen log, its thin body shivering against the cold. It had seen him first, but this time it didn't bolt. It stayed still, watching. Daniel took slow, careful steps forward, lowering himself to its level, just as he had done with the shepherds. "Easy," he murmured, keeping his voice soft, unthreatening. "I'm not here to hurt you." The wolf's ears twitched. It sniffed the air but didn't move. Daniel noticed the deep gash running along its side, partially frozen from the cold. It had been injured, perhaps in a fight, perhaps by something much worse. Daniel took another step closer, then stopped, because from behind the wolf, another shape emerged, a darker threat. His breath caught as a second figure slinked through the trees, a predator. Not another wolf. Something else. A cougar. Daniel's fingers tensed around his rifle. The mountain lion was lean but strong, its golden eyes locked onto the weakened wolf as it prowled forward, shoulders rolling with each silent step. It had been stalking the injured creature, waiting for its moment. The wolf let out a low, warning growl, trying to make itself appear larger, but it was weak. It wouldn't stand a chance if the cougar attacked. Daniel made his decision in an instant. He raised his rifle, not to kill, but to fire a warning shot. The sound shattered the quiet landscape, echoing off the frozen trees. The cougar froze, ears flattening in alarm. A second later it turned and bounded away, disappearing into the wilderness. The wolf, however, didn't move. It was staring at Daniel, its breath shallow, legs trembling. "You're safe now," he murmured. "Let's get you home." The last reunion. Daniel took a step back, giving the wolf space, then slowly gestured for it to follow. To his surprise, it hesitated only a moment before limping forward, step by slow step, as if it understood that he was its only hope. By the time they reached the shelter, the sky was turning amber with the last light of the day. Kara gasped when she saw the wolf. "You actually found it?" Daniel nodded, his face flushed from the cold. "And I wasn't the only one hunting it." As he relayed what had happened, Nina immediately moved forward to assess the wolf's injuries. The shepherds, still resting near the fire, lifted their heads as the newcomer entered. Then, something incredible happened. The injured wolf let out a soft, broken whimper. The smaller shepherd responded with a bark of recognition. A reunion. The larger shepherd stood up, sniffing at the new arrival, its tail giving a tentative wag. And then the injured wolf, though exhausted, collapsed into them. A long-lost sibling. A missing part of their pack. Kara wiped at her eyes. This was why it was searching. Daniel exhaled, feeling warmth spread through his chest. He had followed his instincts, despite the risks. And in the end, it had led them all back together. Home at last. That night, the fire burned warmer than before. The three wolves lay curled together, finally at peace. Kara and Nina made final preparations for their transport, but Daniel knew one thing for sure. They were going home. He sat quietly, watching the sleeping wolves, and smiled. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he had done something truly good. Something that mattered. And for an old man living in the Alaskan wilderness, that was enough. A shepherd's plea, the final journey. The cold wind bit at Daniel Carter's face as he steered his snowmobile across the frozen landscape, his breath coming out in thick clouds. He had been in harsh conditions before, but something about this night felt different, like fate itself was guiding him toward something unfinished. His mind replayed the image of the lone wolf he had seen earlier, weak and trembling. If there was even a chance it was part of the pack, he couldn't turn away now. The hum of the snowmobile filled the stillness, the headlights cutting through the deepening twilight. The tracks he followed were faint, partially covered by the wind-driven snow, but they were there evidence of the wolf's struggle to reach them. The storm had taken its toll on all of them, but he feared the lone wolf had suffered the most. Ahead, the tree line thinned, and he saw the broken stretch of road where Dan and Nina had been working to clear the passage. His radio crackled to life. "Warren, you out there?" Dan's voice was barely audible through the static. Daniel reached for the radio. "I'm approaching the road. Any sign of the wolf?" A pause. Then, "Yeah. About 30 yards north of the clearing. It's slowing down, but it's definitely moving toward your direction. Be careful, it's skittish." Daniel's heart clenched. He pushed the snowmobile faster, his eyes scanning the shadows. And then there. A flash of movement. A thin, limping figure emerging from the trees. Daniel eased off the gas and let the snowmobile idle. Slowly, carefully, he dismounted, stepping away from the machine to avoid frightening the animal. The wolf stood in the clearing, its coat ragged, ribs visible beneath the frost-tipped fur. It swayed slightly on its feet, as if every ounce of strength had been spent just to reach this spot. And yet, even in its exhaustion, its golden eyes locked onto Daniel's with something more than fear recognition. "It knows me." Daniel's breath caught in his throat. Could this truly be one of the missing pack members? A long-lost sibling to the wolves he had sheltered? He swallowed hard, crouching down slowly, making himself as non-threatening as possible. "Easy now," he murmured, voice barely above the whisper of the wind. "You made it. You're safe." The wolf's ears flicked back, uncertain. It took a single step forward, then hesitated. The moment stretched, fragile as ice. Daniel reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a strip of dried meat, something he had taken with him just in case. He extended it, waiting. The wolf sniffed the air. Its hunger won over hesitation. With trembling steps, it closed the distance and gently took the food from his hand. Relief flooded Daniel's chest. He didn't move too fast, didn't reach out. Instead, he simply let the wolf be let it decide. And in that silent understanding, something shifted. The wolf let out a faint, weary whine, the kind he had heard from the two shepherds back at the shelter. A sound of longing. Daniel took a careful breath. "You're looking for them, aren't you?" The wolf lifted its head, and for the first time, Daniel saw the hope behind its exhaustion. The long road home. Securing the wolf for transport wasn't easy. It was too weak to resist much, but its instincts still made it wary of the snowmobile. Daniel worked patiently, murmuring reassurances as he wrapped it in a thick blanket and settled it onto the sled attachment. He signaled Dan on the radio. "Got it. Heading back now." The ride back was slow and careful. The wind had picked up again, carrying fresh flurries of snow across the trail, but Daniel barely felt the cold. His heart pounded with something else entirely. They were so close now. By the time he pulled into the shelter, Kara and Nina were already outside, waiting. "You actually found it?" Kara's voice carried disbelief and awe. Daniel nodded, his throat tight. "Yeah, and I think it belongs with them." The two wolves inside the shelter immediately reacted to the newcomer's scent. The larger shepherd, despite its injuries, rose to its feet, tail wagging in cautious excitement. The smaller one lifted its head and let out a soft, broken whimper. The lone wolf stirred. It tried to stand, its body swaying with fatigue, and then it howled. A weak, fractured sound, but one filled with desperate recognition. The shepherds answered. It was the sound of family calling for one another. And after so much time apart, after so much suffering, they were finally together again. A future beyond the storm. The wolves huddled together, touching noses, their bodies pressed against one another for warmth and reassurance. Daniel felt something in his chest loosen, something he hadn't even realized had been clenched tight for years. Kara wiped at her eyes. "You did it, Daniel." He exhaled, rubbing his hands together to shake off the cold. "We did it." Dan's voice crackled over the radio. "The road's almost clear. We should be able to move them to the center by morning." Daniel looked at the wolves, at the way they curled protectively around one another. They had survived the storm. They had fought through separation and pain. And now, they had a second chance. And so did he. For the first time in years, Daniel didn't feel like an old man simply surviving the days. He felt like someone who mattered. The shelter was silent except for the steady breathing of the wolves. The fire flickered, warm and golden, casting long shadows along the snowy ground. And as Daniel sat beside them, exhaustion settling deep in his bones, he smiled. Because for the first time in a long, long time, he wasn't alone. The shepherd's plea, a final reunion. The moment was electric. The two wolves inside the shelter, exhausted yet alert, stared at the new arrival with a mix of recognition and wariness. The larger wolf, the guardian of its injured sibling, took a step forward, ears pricked, body tense. Daniel Carter stood frozen, watching the silent exchange unfold. Would they accept the newcomer, or would instincts force it away? Kara knelt beside the sled where the third wolf lay thin, trembling but alive. She spoke softly, her tone measured. "If they know each other, they'll tell us." Daniel swallowed. He had seen animals react to each other in countless ways over the years, some violent, some tender, but this moment felt different. This wasn't just another wolf rejoining a pack. This was family, torn apart by the brutal winter, finding each other again. The third wolf let out a weak, warbling whine. Its ears flicked, and it struggled to lift its head despite its weakness. The larger wolf answered with a sound Daniel had never heard before, a mixture of a howl and a soft, guttural rumble. Not aggression. Something deeper. Recognition. Without hesitation, the larger wolf closed the distance, pressing its nose to the weakened newcomer's muzzle, sniffing with deep, deliberate inhales. The smaller wolf, still curled on its blanket, struggled to its feet, despite its injury, and let out a faint, broken yelp. And then it happened. The third wolf, despite its frail body, tried to stand. Its legs shook beneath it, but it leaned into its companions, pressing its head into the thick fur of the larger wolf's neck. The three of them, battered and broken, yet undeniably connected, touched noses, letting out soft whines of comfort. Daniel felt something constrict in his chest. He had seen reunions before, dogs finding lost owners, animals greeting their young after time apart, but this was something primal. A family, shattered by the cruel hand of nature, was whole again. Kara exhaled, brushing her gloved hands down her face. "I think we have our answer. A battle against time." Despite the emotional moment, the reality of their situation loomed. The newest wolf was in worse condition than the others, its coat dull, ribs showing through its thin frame. It wouldn't survive long without proper care. Dan's voice crackled over the radio. "The road's about 70% clear, but we're pushing through hard. If all goes well, we should have a path open by first light." Kara's expression tightened. "We can't wait much longer," she murmured, glancing at the wolves. "They need warmth, food, real medical attention. If this last one doesn't get fluid soon, it might not last the night." Daniel set his jaw. "Then we make sure it does." Together, they worked swiftly, preparing another blanket for the newest arrival, making sure it was nestled between its kin for warmth. Kara administered a light dose of fluids, cautious not to overwhelm its weakened system. Meanwhile, Nina adjusted the makeshift windbreak to trap more heat near the fire. The wolves, despite their ordeal, accepted the human intervention with surprising calmness. The bond between them, unbreakable, seemed to offer strength even in the face of exhaustion. As night settled in, Daniel sat near the fire, watching them rest. The larger wolf kept one paw draped protectively over the injured two, its golden eyes flicking toward Daniel every now and then. "Trust." Kara settled beside him, rubbing warmth back into her fingers. "You did something incredible today, Daniel." He scoffed, shaking his head. I just did what needed doing. She smiled. A lot of people would have left them to fate. But you didn't just save one. You brought back a whole family. Daniel didn't answer right away. Instead, he gazed at the sleeping wolves, their fur rising and falling in synchronized breath. He thought about the loneliness that had sat in his own chest for years. The night spent in silence, listening only to the wind and his own thoughts. Maybe, in some way, they had saved him too. A new dawn. By the time first light crept over the snowdrifts, the radio crackled again. We're through. Dan's voice was breathless but triumphant. The roads clear enough for transport. The relief in the shelter was palpable. They moved quickly, preparing the sleds for travel, reinforcing the blankets around the wolves. The larger wolf, though wary, seemed to understand what was happening. It helped nudge its companions onto the sleds, staying close, never leaving their side. The final journey was slow and steady. Daniel rode ahead, his snowmobile cutting a path through the freshly packed trail, while Dan and Nina followed with the sleds. Kara kept a careful eye on the wolves, making sure they remained stable. The hours passed in a blur. When they finally reached the wildlife center, the team was waiting. Medics and handlers rushed forward, ready to assess the wolves and start their road to recovery. Daniel helped unload them, watching as they were carried inside toward warmth, safety, and a chance at healing. And just before they disappeared through the doors, the larger wolf, the one who had fought so hard to protect its family, turned back. For a fleeting second, it held Daniel's gaze. A silent thank you. Daniel swallowed against the lump in his throat. He gave a small nod. You're safe now. You did your part. And so did I. The weight of compassion. As the sun climbed higher, Daniel stood outside the center, watching the snow-dusted trees sway in the breeze. His journey with the wolves was over, but something inside him had changed. Maybe it was the realization that even in the harshest winters, life found a way. That even the wildest of creatures carried love, loyalty, and the need for family. Or maybe it was the simple fact that, for the first time in years, he had allowed himself to care. Kara stepped beside him, hands in her coat pockets. You should come back sometime, she said. Check in on them. See how they're doing. Daniel glanced at her, then back at the trees. He thought of the nights spent by the fire, the howls in the dark, the moment when a wolf too weak to stand had chosen to trust him. And for the first time in a long, long while, he wasn't afraid of belonging to something again. A small smile touched his lips. Yeah, he said. I think I just might. The shepherd's plea, a home for the lost. The days that followed the wolves' departure left an unexpected stillness in Daniel Carter's cabin. Gone were the quiet whines at night, the rustle of paws against the wooden floor, and the watchful golden eyes that had studied him with both caution and trust. The absence of their presence left a void, but in its place came something else, a deep, abiding sense of purpose. For years, Daniel had lived alone in the Alaskan wilderness, isolated by choice. The world beyond his cabin felt distant, irrelevant. He had told himself he preferred solitude, that the company of people was more trouble than it was worth. But now, as he sat by his fire, the empty space where the wolves had once curled near the hearth seemed to whisper a different truth. He had saved them. More than that, they had saved him too. He found himself wondering how they were adjusting to their temporary home at the wildlife center. Had the injured one, now nestled safely among its family, begun to regain its strength? Was the third wolf, the one he had risked himself to rescue, eating well and recovering from the brutal winter's grip? Had the larger wolf, the unwavering protector, finally been able to rest without fear? Daniel exhaled, rubbing his hand over his face. He couldn't just sit here wondering. He needed to see them. The first visit. The journey to the wildlife center was a long one, but Daniel didn't mind. As he pulled into the parking lot, his heartbeat quickened with something he hadn't felt in a long time: anticipation. Inside, Kara greeted him with a warm smile. I was wondering when you'd come, she said, leading him down a hallway toward the enclosures. They doing okay? Daniel asked, his voice rough. Kara nodded. Better than we hoped. The injured one, now officially named Luna, is responding well to treatment. She's still weak, but she's putting weight on the leg. The third wolf, Echo, is still underweight, but eating regularly. And as for the big guy, Bran, he's been keeping an eye on both of them, like always. Daniel let out a small chuckle. Sounds about right. Kara stopped in front of a large outdoor enclosure, where snow-dusted trees and rocks mimicked their natural environment. Daniel's breath caught as he spotted them. Bran stood tall, his amber eyes scanning the area, ever vigilant. Echo lay curled nearby, his coat looking healthier than before, his ears flicking as he dozed in the sun. And in the center, Luna rested, her injured legs stretched out, though she looked more at ease than Daniel had ever seen her. Then something unexpected happened. Bran turned his head and saw him. The wolf's ears pricked, his body tensed, but not in fear. Recognition dawned in his golden gaze. He stepped forward, slowly at first, then more deliberately. Echo lifted his head, sniffing the air, and even Luna stirred. Bran let out a sound, a low, quiet whine, almost imperceptible. A greeting. Daniel swallowed hard, pressing his hand against the fence. "Hey there, big guy." The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken understanding. Bran didn't break eye contact. He just stood there, watching, as if remembering every moment they had shared the snowstorm, the long nights by the fire, the trust that had been built when survival had been uncertain. Kara, standing beside Daniel, whispered, "He remembers you." Daniel's throat tightened. "I think I remember him too." Letting go and moving forward. The visits became more frequent. Once a week, Daniel made the trip to the wildlife center, standing by the enclosure, watching, listening, simply being there. He didn't expect anything in return, but over time, Bran's posture became less guarded. Luna would watch him quietly, while Echo, ever the cautious one, kept a comfortable distance. One afternoon, as Daniel stood by the fence, Bran did something that stunned him. The wolf walked up slowly, carefully, until there was only a few feet of space between them. He lowered his head, sniffed the air, and then gently, deliberately pressed his nose against the fence near Daniel's hand. A silent thank you. Daniel let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "You're gonna be okay," he murmured. Kara, who'd been watching, smiled. "They'll be ready soon." Daniel turned to her. "For what?" "The release," she said. "We're planning it for next month. Their pack's been spotted in the region. We think they'll have the best chance of reuniting." Daniel's heart clenched. He knew this day would come, but hearing it felt different. He had to let them go. "Can I be there?" he asked after a moment. Kara's smile widened. "I was hoping you'd ask." The final goodbye. The day of the release was crisp, the mountains wrapped in a veil of mist as Daniel stood with the team at the edge of the wilderness. The crates were opened, one by one, and the wolves hesitated at first, sniffing the cold air. Bran was the first to step out. He stretched, shook out his coat, and surveyed the land before turning to his siblings. With a soft nudge, he urged Luna forward. Echo followed, wary as ever, but there was no fear in his movements, only a quiet determination. Daniel stood back, hands in his pockets, watching. Bran turned one last time. Their eyes met across the snow-covered field. And then, with a final glance, the wolves ran. Luna, her injured leg no longer holding her back, bounded after her brothers. Echo disappeared into the trees like a shadow, and Bran, loyal, fierce, free, led them into the wild where they belonged. Daniel felt the loss like an ache in his chest, but it wasn't sorrow. It was gratitude. Kara touched his arm. "You okay?" He nodded, smiling faintly. "I think I am." As the last of the wolves vanished into the wilderness, Daniel turned back toward his truck, the wind biting against his face. He had come to this land looking for solitude. Instead, he had found something greater. A reason to care. A reason to fight. And maybe, just maybe, a reason to start again. A shepherd's plea, the bond that changed everything. The wind howled outside Daniel Carter's cabin, carrying with it the weight of solitude he had once embraced. But something had changed. The stillness that once comforted him now felt different, as if the land itself carried the echoes of those he had sheltered. The three wolves, Luna, Echo, and Bran, were gone. Their absence was felt deeply, yet knowing they were healing brought him peace. True to her word, Kara sent updates regularly. Photos of the wolves lounging in the sun, their fur no longer ragged from the brutal winter, their bodies growing stronger. The smaller wolf, Luna, had begun using her injured leg more, the bandages coming off little by little. Echo, once frail and afraid, had gained weight and confidence. And Bran loyal, ever watchful Bran remained their guardian, his golden eyes filled with a quiet determination. Each update made Daniel smile. He imagined the day when the enclosure's gate would open and they would bound back into the wild, free as they were meant to be. Would they pause? Look back for just a second? He hoped so. But even if they didn't, he would know he had done right by them. Life at the cabin resumed its steady rhythm. Daniel chopped wood, tended to his small greenhouse, and prepared for the remaining winter months. But things felt different now. He had always seen nature as something to endure, something relentless and indifferent. Now, he understood its balance, how survival and kindness could coexist, how even the fiercest creatures sought warmth in times of desperation. He kept an extra blanket near the hearth, though he told himself it was just for emergencies. Deep down, he knew why. One evening, as he sat by the fire, he thought of them, of their unshaken loyalty, their silent resilience. And he realized, perhaps for the first time, that solitude no longer felt so absolute. If this story of unexpected compassion touched your heart, let us know in the comments. Have you ever witnessed a bond between humans and wild creatures that challenged what you believed? Share your experiences, we'd love to hear them. And don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and stay tuned for more stories that remind us kindness can spark miracles where we least expect them. Lessons from the Wolves, finding compassion in an unforgiving world. In many ways, Daniel Carter's experience with the wolves mirrors the struggles we face in our own lives. We live in a world that often feels harsh and unrelenting, where survival sometimes seems to depend on shutting others out, protecting ourselves from vulnerability, and focusing only on our own needs. But just like the wolves who found themselves lost, wounded, and desperate for help, there comes a time when we all need compassion, and more importantly, when we must choose to extend it to others. Daniel could have turned the wolves away, assuming they were dangerous or beyond saving. After all, isn't that the easy thing to do? To see something or someone in pain and convince ourselves it's not our problem? Instead, he opened his door, took a risk, and in doing so, changed not only their lives but his own. The lesson is clear. Compassion is never wasted. It has the power to heal, to rebuild trust, and to transform lives, both for those who receive it and for those who give it. In today's fast-paced world, it's easy to become desensitized to the struggles of others. Whether it's a stranger in need, a friend going through a silent battle, or even our own family members who mask their pain, we often overlook suffering because we're too busy or too fearful to get involved. But like Daniel, when we take a moment to notice, to truly see the struggle in front of us, we have an opportunity to make a difference. A kind word, a helping hand, a moment of patience can mean the difference between despair and hope for someone else. The wolves also teach us another important lesson. Healing takes time, and it is not a journey meant to be taken alone. Luna, the injured wolf, could not have survived without her siblings' protection. Echo, the lone wolf, needed the reassurance of family before he could find the strength to go on. And even Bran, the strongest of the three, found himself relying on Daniel in a moment of uncertainty. In the same way, no matter how strong or independent we believe ourselves to be, we all need support. We all need a place of safety, whether it's in the form of a home, a friendship, or even a quiet moment of understanding. Perhaps the most powerful takeaway from Daniel's story is that kindness does not go unnoticed. Though the wolves could not express gratitude in words, their actions spoke volumes. The way they trusted him, the way they reunited, the way they eventually returned to the wild, stronger than before. In life, the kindness we show to others may not always be acknowledged immediately, but that doesn't mean it isn't felt. A single act of compassion can ripple outward, touching lives in ways we may never fully realize. So what if we all chose to be like Daniel? What if we extended a hand instead of turning away? What if we allowed ourselves to feel deeply, to care, to take risks for the sake of others? The world might still be harsh at times, but in those moments of connection, when we offer warmth to those in need, we remind ourselves that we are not alone. And in that, we find something even greater than survival. We find purpose. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and follow for more new stories every day.